Good evening, and welcome to the very last Australian Literature 102 session for this year. I'm pleased to have with me for this final session Andrea Goldsmith, who I'm sure you will all know as a novelist. She's the author of 7 novels, which including The Prosperous Thief, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award, Reunion, and most recently The Memory Trap, which was earlier this year, came out, I think. And Andrea is here to talk to us this evening, again quite fittingly, I think, for the last session of the year, about the presiding genius of Australian literature, Patrick White, and specifically his middle period novel, Riders in the Chariot, from 1961. So, without further ado, Andrea, if you'd like to go to the lectern. Thank you.
Well, I'll lay my cards on the table at the beginning. I believe Patrick White is the greatest, perhaps the only true great writer Australia has produced. In 1973, he became the first and only Australian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Coetzee won his in 2003, before he took out Australian citizenship. It's no matter that Patrick White was born in England, no matter that he was schooled there and lived there as a young man, his work is steeped in his being an Australian, or rather steeped in his abrasive relationship with Australia. Sometimes the Nobel judges get it astonishingly wrong, but not in the case of White. I don't like all his books, but then only the mediocre man is always at his best, as Somerset Maugham once wrote in defence of himself. But when asked for my list of 10 Australian classics, Patrick takes up 4 spaces, with Riders, The Twyborn Affair, The Vivisector, and Eye of the Storm. And I should, at the outset, explain the familiarity. Patrick and I share the same agent, Barbara Mobbs. That's why I use his first name. James Stern, in reviewing The Tree of Man for the New York Times Book Review back in 1955, defined the essence of a classic. This is what he wrote. Almost all novels are transients. Very few remain on, permanent residents of the mind. Of those that do, some cease to be books and become part of the reader's past, of an experience felt so deeply it's sometimes difficult to believe that the illusion has not been lived. From these rare works of literature, characters emerge better known than our most intimate friends, for every human being has a secret life. To reveal in a novel this life, which is that of the soul, in such a way that by the time the last page is reached, all questions have been answered, while all the glory and mystery of the world remains, is not only the prime function of the novelist, but the artist's greatest ambition, and surely his rarest or her rarest achievement. A classic doesn't need to be the most brilliantly written book, nor does it need to be popular in its day, but it does need to stand the test of time. In this regard, it's important to distinguish between classic and popular. So, for example, Christos Tsiolkos's The Book The Slap is popular, but whether it will become a classic requires a couple more decades. A classic work of literature also needs to address fundamental and universal human issues. If it doesn't, it'll become dated. And it needs to do so in an original way. Riders in the Chariot is about the conflict between good and evil. It's about exile and belonging, and human brutality pitted against great humanity. All of these are fundamental human qualities, and all are as relevant today as they've ever been. Indeed, it could be easily argued that a book driven by these ideas is even more relevant in today's bullish, combative, humanely bereft world. Riders in the Chariot was White's 6th novel. It was published in early October 1961 when he was 49 years old. It came after The Tree of Man and Voss. It received some enthusiastic reviews here in Australia and in the UK, although more tempered in the US, where he had previously triumphed. But overall, they were the best reviews he'd ever had. The novel won the Miles Franklin Award. It was his second, because Voss won the inaugural Miles. In his correspondence, Patrick referred to it as his Jewish book, but it could equally be his Aboriginal book, his Christian book, his outsider book. It could also be his exploding myths about Australian culture book, myths such as mateship, support for the underdog, egalitarianism, and a fair go for all. Riders is dedicated to his friend Clary Daniel and his American publisher Ben Hooch, both Jewish. Hooch at Viking US published White's first novel, Happy Valley, and would be with him for 5 books. He died at the age of 88 in 1963, just as Patrick was getting started on the solid mandala. Hooch was a visionary publisher, and oh how we mourn the passing of the likes of him. The first in the fundamentally puritanical US to publish James Joyce and D.H. Lawrence, amongst others. Clary Daniel, Sydney-based, was a refugee from Hungary who enjoyed with White a very close relationship for 10 years before the inevitable falling out. Cauliflower salad finally did it, but in truth, he got sick of her. In fact, he was dispersing most of his Jewish friends after the publication of Riders, according to Marr in his absolutely brilliant biography of Patrick White. Riders was for White his Jewish book because of the 4 main characters that fuel the narrative of the novel. It was the character of Mordecai Himmelfarb who presented the greatest challenges to him. White had written Aboriginal Australians before, and his good salt-of-the-earth characters like Mary Godbold are all over his novels. Eccentricity such as that manifest by Miss Hare was no problem for him, but Jewishness, in particular a German Jew who had survived the Holocaust, was new for him. In fact, it was new for most people at the time. In 1961, there'd been little written about the Holocaust and hardly anything in fiction. These days, there are whole sections in bookshops devoted to the Holocaust. There are Holocaust studies at universities. There are Holocaust museums. There are Holocaust films, from Sophie's Choice and the Piano to the fake and sentimental Life is Beautiful. It's lovely getting in your own little personal opinions here. And umpteen documentaries, of which the most profound and comprehensive is Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, and yes, he did have a longish affair with Simone de Beauvoir. That's Lanzmann, not White. There's a huge Holocaust industry now, but there was not at the time of White's writing. As usual, Patrick White was well ahead of everyone else. I've read Riders 3 times, the first time around 1980, then in 1996 and again this year. In between, I've often dipped into portions of this novel as a means of feeding my own writing. White is a master of detail, and he's a master at metaphor. He's a master of characterisation. His ideas are just so rich and fleshy. He's been a gift to this novelist, to any writer who revels in the richness of English. 3 readings of Riders in the Chariot, and I've never regarded it as a Jewish book, much less a Holocaust book. And I still don't. It's a novel about outsiders, exiles either at home, like Miss Hare, Mrs. Godbold and Elf Dubbo, or exiles from home, like Himmelfarb. And it's a great novel of spirituality, of those riders in the chariot, God's chosen 4, embodying the Spirit of the Lord as described in Ezekiel chapter 1. Each rider with 4 faces and 4 wings, joined together and going forward together, vague to the reader, even to themselves, but each of them instantly recognisable to the other. The writing of Riders stretched through 4 years. One of the earliest mentions of his Jewish novel is in a letter White wrote to Ben Hooch, Mr. Hooch, in February 1957. The novel is already brewing, but White writes, "I may not have the courage to embark on anything so esoteric." His first mention of the title, Riders in the Chariot, is in September of that year, also in a letter to Mr. Hooch, always addressed as Mr. Hooch. The brooding continues while at the same time Voss is making its way in the world and Patrick is occupied with the various machinations of publication and reviews, many hostile. In February 1958, a year after he first mentioned the new novel to his American publisher and just before he and Manoli Lascaris, his partner, left for 8 months overseas, he writes again to Hooch, "If I were not going away, I think I might start Riders in the Chariot at this point. Always when I meet with lack of understanding in Australian critics, most recently to Voss, I feel like sitting down and starting another of the novels they deplore to give them further cause for complaint. Oh dear, it's going to be a very trying book to write, but I'm living with it all the time now. It's shaping and altering, and the four voices of what I like to think of as a kind of cantata are beginning to sing in the way that finally they must." In this same letter, he refers to Himmelfarb as a Zadik, one of the 36 Jews of exemplary righteousness, secret saints believed to be on earth at any one time. White and Manoli returned to Sydney in October of 1958, that year. Once home, he starts to write Riders. Just 10 weeks later, just before Christmas, he writes to Mr. Hooch, "I have started on my new book and have written how much it's difficult to say. Perhaps a third, perhaps not so much, but I can see it will take some time and perhaps need as many as 3 writings. I shall want someone here to check the Jewish parts after a second writing. I feel I may have given myself away a good deal, although passages I've been able to check for myself seem to have come through either by instinct or good luck, so perhaps I shall survive. After all, I did survive the deserts of Voss." By May 1959, he's written 90,000 words and anticipates it'll come in at 120. He was way off there. He describes the book as follows to Mr. Hooch. "The book does not have an exclusively Jewish theme. What I wanted to emphasise through my 4 riders, an Orthodox refugee intellectual Jew, a mad Erdgeist, earth spirit of an Australian spinster, an evangelical laundress." I love the image of this ambiguous description, an evangelical laundress, and a half-caste Aboriginal painter. Is that what he wants to emphasise is that all faiths, whether religious, humanistic, instinctive, or the creative artist's act of praise, are in fact one. By January 1960, he reports to Hooch that he's finished the first version of Riders in the Chariot. He confesses, among other things, that it's run to some 200,000 words. He emphasises the figure with an exclamation mark. He gets Clary Daniel to check the Jewish bits. She was Hungarian and not German, which might explain some of the mistakes, which I will mention later. The second version is finished by August 1960, and now it's 230,000 words, which I would say is about the length of the book that we have today. White has tried it out on a Jewish friend and he's feeling far more confident. He wants the approval of Jewish readers. In a short letter to Mr. Hooch, but signed Patrick, he writes, "I'm about to send the manuscript of Riders in the Chariot by airmail, first or second class, depending on the sum involved." Patrick had plenty of money, but was often protective of it. After Patrick's death, Manoli was surprised to learn how much money there was, given the frugal way they'd been living. As for White's finished manuscripts, they were always typed on what was known as Onionskin airmail paper, single-spaced, impossible to read. When he hears back from Hooch within the month, he writes, "Dear Ben, to burst into first names so late in the day. Your letter and cable were a great relief. You have been the true judge over so many decades. Himmelfarb was a worry because he had to be just right. In the end, what helped me most was the fact that throughout my life, I have been an outcast myself in one way and another. First a child with what kind of a strange gift nobody quite knew, then a despised colonial boy in an English public school, finally an artist in horrified Australia, to give you just a few instances. Hooch loved the book. Geoffrey Dutton, Jeff, whom I knew, was one of the early readers pre-publication. Patrick writes to Hooch, "Geoffrey has gone off his head about it, but of course he is a very superior Australian." Of course, there was the mandatory falling out with Jeff Dutton within a few years, actually. Okay, to the novel. Riders in the Chariot is set in fictional Sarsaparilla on the outskirts of Sydney. Sarsaparilla draws on Castle Hill, where Patrick and Manoli had a small farm, Dogwoods, where they came to live in 1948 when they arrived in Australia, and they lived there until they moved to Martin Road opposite Centennial Park in 1964. At Castle Hill, they felt the Sydney suburbs encroaching on them, just as they encroach on Sarsaparilla in the novel. The fibro houses that replaced Xanadu, Miss Hare's crumbling mansion, also came to Castle Hill. The structure of the book is very simple. The narrative is handed between four main characters with a little overlap. Mary Hare, Miss Hare, opens the novel. Firstly, the significance of the name. Mary anointed and dried the feet of Jesus. Late in the novel, Mary Hare warms the feet of the dying Himmelfarb, the Jesus figure of the novel. And hare, H-A-R-E, the animal hare. Hares have a rich mythological tradition, pre-Christian with pagan flavour, often associated with the lunar cycle. And Miss Hare is powerfully connected with the natural world. She's a quintessential pagan. She's also a spinster. She lives in the family mansion Xanadu, which is now crumbling about her. She needs help in the house. She needs help with everyday living, and has just organised for a housekeeper, Mrs. Jolly, to come and live with her. Mrs. Jolly is ordinary, unimaginative, and incapable or even interested in understanding her sometimes eccentric employer. She is one of the evil ones in the novel. She and her friend Mrs. Flack truly demonstrate the banality of evil, to draw on that famous phrase of Hannah Arendt's. Mordecai Himmelfarb has the same initials as Mary Hare, MH, and given the importance of names to the novelist, I cannot think it is accidental. Himmelfarb translates to Himmel, meaning sky or heaven, and Farb, colour. So Himmelfarb then thus becomes the colour of heaven. He is the Jesus figure, the Zadig. He was, before he came to Australia, he was a professor of English in provincial Germany. After the death of his wife and the loss of job, home and freedom at the hands of the Nazis, Himmelfarb eventually makes his way to Australia, to Sydney. He takes on manual work, this intellectual, at the Brighter Bicycle Lamps factory. The intellect has failed us, he says. Ruth Godbold has resonances with the biblical Ruth, the loyal, ever-faithful woman who says to her mother-in-law Naomi, "Entreat me not to leave thee." And Godbold, well, it is exactly as it suggests. Mrs. Godbold is a washerwoman living in a shack with her many children and an abusive, violent, unfaithful, boozing husband. She was born and raised in what she describes as flat fen country, probably the fen country in eastern England, particularly as she mentions the great cathedral, and this area is known for its churches and cathedrals. After the death of her brother and mother, Ruth Joyner, as she was known then, migrates to Sydney alone, where she enters service with Mrs. Chalmers Robinson. It is there she meets her future husband, the iceman Tom, the man who delivers the ice. And the fourth rider is elf Dubbo, the half-caste, removed from his black mother to live with the Reverend Timothy Calderon and his sister Mrs. Pask, whose now dead husband the Reverend adored. The traditional land of the Dubbo Gar, or the Dubbo mob, is located where the town of Dubbo is today. The name Dubbo comes from a red or blood pigment found in the earth of the area and highly prized. Alf is a painter. He has an almost magical feel for colour. It was as a boy in the house of the Calderons that he discovers painting, becomes enthralled to it, and on his 13th birthday receives Mrs. Pask's old paint box. His has been a rough life and a tough one. He, like Himmelfarb, also works at brighter bicycle lamps. So these are the four riders. We meet them singly or in pairs. Only at the end of the book do they all come together in the same place, although Dubbo remains outside the group, staring in at the others through the window of Godbold's house. I must say I wanted the four, I always want the four to be properly joined, but once, just once in this long book. But Dubbo has a job to do. He loads the vision through Godbold's window with panegyric blue, or that might be panegyric, it's not a word that you ever speak, you read it or write it, the laudatory blue, his secret blue, and goes home to paint it, goes home and paints the four riders in the chariot. The greatest danger of a narrative where there are several equally weighted characters is that the reader comes to prefer some of the characters over others, making the book proceed with lurches and falls. On my first reading, the book was dominated by Himmelfarb. On my second, it was Miss Hare, and Himmelfarb. On this, my most recent reading, I have been drawn strongly to Godbold and Dubbo. It might be maturity. On the fourth, it will be different again. Of course, your reading pleasure may have been disrupted by other things, most particularly White's unique, fleshy, evocative writing style. Indeed, some readers find his writing plotted to the point of unreadable. The fact is that when subjected to analysis, many of White's sentences don't make sense. It's not simply the way he drops the subject off a sentence or omits a verb. Sometimes the sentences, if put through a reality scrim, are plain absurd. And yet the overall effect of the language is profound. It reminds me of Mark Rothko's huge canvases of colour. I've stood before a Rothko with tears rolling down my usually very, very private cheeks. Such a profound effect these canvases have, and I don't subject it to analysis because I don't want to destroy the experience. White's sentences exert a similar power and allude to a similar mystery. But I will admit that at times, particularly in the first third of the book, I read paragraphs that sounded almost like a parody of White. And here's an example. It's about Miss Hare's father. She's thinking back. Years after, when his stature was even further diminished in her memory, her mind would venture in foxy fashion or more blinderingly worm-like in search of a concealed truth. This quote notwithstanding, most of the time, when I find myself verbally overwhelmed, I'll stop and then reread the seething paragraph, often out loud, and then I'll understand what White is getting at. And to be honest, at the end of reading, I feel hugely fortunate to have read such language. Here's a couple, maybe only one, extremely lush paragraph. I think it's wonderful. This is from an early Himmelfarb section telling of his past. The issue is discussed of why, with the rise of Hitler, Jews didn't leave. There were many, however, in the aching villas, in the thin dwellings of congested alleys, in tasteful beige apartments who, for a variety of reasons, could not detach themselves from the ganglion of Europe. their bones protested, or they loved their furniture, or they must surely be overlooked, or they were drunk with kisses, or transfixed by presentiments of immolation, or too diffident to believe they might take their destiny in hand, or of such faith they waited for divine direction. These remained. And the air was tightening. All remarks, even the silent ones, were aimed at them. Their own thoughts suspected doors, flattened themselves against the walls, against the dying paper roses, and pissed down the sides of lavatory bowls to avoid giving their presence away. The highlighted bits, when read analytically, are kind of nonsense, but within the paragraph they create emotion, tension, temperature, everything. The sum is definitely more than the parts. This sort of writing strikes me as evocative and true. With a writer like Patrick White, you need to trust him to know what he's doing. If you do, then you'll glide over the difficult bits. He knows where he's going. Even if you don't, he'll guide you. So you need to trust this literary master. But at the same time, you can't read his books empty-handed. He expects his readers to have a reasonable historical, artistic and literary literacy. He expects people to know about Hitler and the Nazis, neither are mentioned by name, also Kristallnacht. He expects us to know enough about art to understand the type of painting that is Dubbo's. And as with all great writers, you have to forgive him his mistakes, and there are mistakes, with his German Jew in particular. For example, on Kristallnacht, and it's a fabulous scene in the novel. It would, however, be most unlikely that Reha, Himmelfarb's wife, would have been taken away or even harmed, much less killed. Jewish men and boys were targeted, and while 30,000 Jews were rounded up on that night of the 9th and 10th of November in 1938 and sent to camps, many had been returned within 6 weeks. And I think he rather labours the point with the riders in the chariot. It is mentioned many, many times. He has written his 4 main characters as visionaries, as illuminates. It's not necessary for him to explicate the whys and hows. And occasionally, this master of English will occasionally get a word wrong. In a Himmelfarb section before Himmelfarb leaves Europe, in a portion written from Himmelfarb's point of view, White uses the word dug, D-U-G, for breast. It's quite wrong. Firstly, when used to describe a woman's breast, it's a derogatory term, and Himmelfarb is not wanting to be derogatory. The origin of the word is unknown, but it sounds like English slang and absolutely not the sort of word to be used by a European intellectual. But quibbles like this are, in fact, only quibbles, and few in number. There's a fabulous tone to Riders in the Chariot, not magical realism, but it does require a suspension of belief, not customary with realist fiction. Sometimes there's an almost incantatory feel to this work. Mies van der Rohe, the great modernist architect, said that God, truth, resides in the details. This Patrick White knew, and his detail is breathtaking. He has a bus driver clean his ears with a key. Tom Godbold, Mrs. Godbold's husband, had fine dark eyes and one of those long tanned faces, too thin. It made Ruth Godbold, think of used pennies. She would have gone on looking at the man's face if he had not been in it. It was only later that everyone realised that Tom Godbold's tragic eyes had merely been looking deeper into himself. In referring to the evil Mrs. Jolly, White writes of the swept chambers of her mind. How much better than empty-headed. And there's humour too. When someone enters the office at Brighter Lamps, the stenographer did not rise, of course, having reduced her obligations at the salary received. Then there are the ideas, the risks, the breathtaking narrative flair of this novel. White portrays evil through Flack and Jolly, a couple of petty bourgeois widows. He infuses pity into the wealthy Mr. Rosetree, Chaim Rosenbaum that was. He displays goodness and a whole lot more in a washerwoman, a mad spinster, a German Jewish refugee, a hard-drinking Aboriginal painter. People pushed to the margins tend to have a clearer view of mainstream society, not simply their unique perspective, but as well they're not blinded by mainstream values. And certainly this is the case with White's Four Riders. There's another much more uncomfortable truth in this novel, that all positive qualities, kindness, humility, generosity, faithfulness, creativity, learning, make those who do not have those qualities uncomfortable, can even turn them into brutes. To some, this is a quote, "It is always unendurable to watch the antithesis of themselves." It's not enough that Blue and his mates, the lucky 7 lads who win the lottery towards the end of the novel, crucify Himmelfarb. They set fire to his wooden house, thinking he's inside. Miss Hare, also thinking Himmelfarb is burning to death, accuses them. "You've killed him." The boys beat, or young men actually, they beat the flames off her and continue to belt at her now with their dislike and their consciences in addition to their coats. At a time when we call those seeking asylum sanctuary criminals and banish them to places we've never been nor are ever likely to go, at a time of race riots in Cronulla and Indians fearing for their safety in Melbourne streets and security guards at all Jewish schools, Riders in the Chariot remains of enduring relevance. Go home, the watching rabble shouts as Himmelfarb is hoisted on the tree. Just like us now, go home, to anyone who is different. The relevance of Riders remains because we continue to fear the outsider, outsiders like the four Riders. Rather than try and understand their difference, we berate and condemn those who cause our discomfort, just like those men who crucified the Jew Himmelfarb on Good Friday, who beat Dubbo, who ostracised Miss Hare, who deride Mrs. Godbold as simple. This great novel of the outsider is, in my opinion, more powerful and certainly more relevant to today's world than when it was written.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. When you were just at the end there, when you were talking about the kind of moral vision that White puts forward in this novel, it actually reminded me of I don't know if you've read Robert Gray's memoir, The Land I Came Through Last. Have you read? No. There's a section in there where he talks about he knew White, and there's a little scene there where he remembers he was at Patrick White's place and he made the mistake of switching on the evening news. And Patrick flew into a rage and made him turn it off. And he said, you think people think that when you get older you become immune to the world's suffering, but it's the opposite. It gets worse. Yes. And I really like that anecdote because it seems to me there are those two sides of White united there. He flies into a rage, and he's notoriously cantankerous old man, but he's in a rage because of essentially a compassionate motivation.
And I actually see the compassionate White in all of his books, but gee whiz, it's in this one. It really is in this one. And you don't have to be religious, you don't have to have a deep spiritual feeling, because it's about being human. I think it's an extraordinary book.
Well, the thing I was going to put to you first was actually, I have a quote here from an article David Malouf wrote a few years ago. It was in the TLS, you might have read it, but it was just a kind of overview of White's career. And he wrote this quite nice little encapsulation of his reading of Riders in the Chariot, which I just thought I'd read out and get a response from you, because it's somewhat at odds with what you've been saying. He says, I'm quoting here, "Of the four saints of Riders, Ruth Godbold and Mary Hare are among White's most fully imagined and deeply felt creations. Of the others, Mordecai Himmelfarb now seems worked up, though the Auschwitz scenes and the lady from Chernowitz retain their power. And Alf Dubbo, the blackfellow or half-caste painter, is at this point embarrassing. He then goes on to talk about some of the minor characters, but he then says, he ends up by saying, in writers, White's fascination with a Blakean, God-driven world without God is at its most desolate. It is his large attempt to deal with the lostness of the 20th century. Now, do you think, that view of Alf Dubbo as embarrassing and as Mordecai Himmelfarb as being somewhat worked up, as not entirely successful? Do you? You've said that your attitude to the characters changed somewhat.
What I said about trusting White to know what he's doing is it's a general thing that I have for a lot of writers that I admire, that they might write stuff that I don't agree with. They might write stuff that's actually wrong. But overall, their writing, their ideas, their thoughts, their whole motivation, their passion is such that I will still go along with them. Look, David's absolutely right about what he says about Dubbo, and to throw in the sex between Dubbo and the Reverend seemed a tad gratuitous to show that Dubbo was much in need of love, a tad gratuitous, and a few other things besides. But I decided that I would go along with White's premise. And I know what he wanted to do, and I see Dubbo there are these scenes of, in whorehouses and what have you that really, do you think Patrick ever went to a whorehouse? Of course he didn't. Well, I don't think so. But I focus very, very much on the painting. And he had a role to do.
As characters, they are characters, but they also have a symbolic function within the structure.
That's exactly right.
Structure of the novel. In the case of Alf Dubbo, he is, of course, the language that is used to talk about him is quite dated now. He's a half-caste, but that's kind of symbolic of him being between these two cultures.
And I think, actually, you're absolutely right. These characters are all symbols. That's why I sort of say that there's it's not realist fiction in the way we understand realist fiction. I think it's interesting that David Malouf singles out the two women. The two men die. Sorry if you haven't read it, but the two men die. The women live on. Godbold, Mrs. Godbold, is a character that's been criticised for being, yet another one of White sentimentalising the working class. And he does. He absolutely does. And they can kind of do no wrong. He'd never have a baddie from the working class, ever. Only ever from his own class, the moneyed class. So you could criticise her for that. And as far as Hare's concerned, at time she is just she's so riven with extremes that that's what happened to my response on the first reading, that Hare just simply did not gel, but later she did. But I just don't think that you can read this novel as realist fiction.
No, I agree.
It's a great moral tale.
Whatever. I don't know what the genre is, but it's not realism, whatever it is. But yeah, I think that, and there's great symbolic importance to it in the fact that it is the Aboriginal character who has the artistic responsibility.
I like that.
And it seems to me that seems to be particularly significant because all of the religious symbolism is actually, it's very overtly Christian, a lot of it. So you actually have this in that final scene that you mentioned where the two women are nursing the dying Himmelfarb and he is watching. He is the one who takes away, he's not actually in the scene, but he's the one who has the responsibility in that scene, the artistic responsibility.
And I love that. Everything has been turned around. Early on, when we meet Dubbo, he's the bookish one. I mean, Himmelfarb, we're told, was the scholar, but he's given that all away when he comes to Australia. But Dubbo first learns about painting in a book that he finds in the Reverend's house, and the picture that he saw is the Riders of Apollo. There's something of Apollo by the French artist Redon.
You had your little postcard. It might be a bit small to see if you had. Well, in fact, it's on the cover here. This is a kind of section of it.
Oh, look, it is too. I ran it off.
But I think White mentions that in his letters as as being haunted by that painting.
I have extras. It's a fabulous painting. It's called The Chariot of Apollo. Yeah. And it was painted over a decade from 1905 to 16.
And just on Alf Dubbo as the kind of the reader. I mean, I think when Himmelfarb first encounters him, he's reading the Bible. He's reading Ezekiel
in the toilet, in the male bathroom.
And I'm not sure if it's in that scene, but somewhere he says, he says you're reading the Bible, and he says, oh yeah, I'm reading the Bible, but not for the reasons that the Reverend has told him. This is significant to him. He gets what he wants out of it.
Yeah,
he's not reading it through that cultural framework.
And at that point, Dubbo's actually got the voice of White. Absolutely got the voice of White.
Yeah, well, some years ago I had occasion to review a book about the figure of the Indigenous figures in white. There's only 3 novels in which they do appear, and that's Voss, Riders, and Fringe of Leaves. And the author of that book had this quite interesting theory that the reason Dubbo was the artist, the Aboriginal figure was the artist, was that it had to be an Indigenous figure who could synthesise these cultural influences into a new vision that is in fact at home in Australia. Or not.
It could have been, Patrick just wanting to have a go at everybody and giving the artistic sensibility to the Aboriginal character. He would never have used the word Indigenous ever.
No. But the artist is a crucial figure, and and the novel itself, I mean, Alpha is like Lily Briscoe in Wolf's To the Lighthouse, where the realisation of the vision is actually in the artistic vision. So in a certain sense, the novel's vision and the final painting, where he does actually realise that vision, is the kind of moment that brings it all together. So he is the synthesising character.
And I think that when White, in that letter that I quoted, when he talks about what the book is all about, and that it's not essentially a religious book, but it's talking about the various sensibilities, various passions, including that of the artist. And I think that's exactly what the book is about. And yes, probably embodied more in Dubbo.
If it's not, as you say, it's not necessarily religious in a narrow sense, but it is, of course, quite mystical, and in certain respects, sort of there is an anti-rationalism that runs through this theme, where rationality is kind of the enemy. In fact, I had this I noticed. You were quoting quite a bit from his letters, but he did say in one of his letters about this book, if I have the right bit of paper here, he said, he's talking of writers, he said, more than anything, it is a profession of faith, so it will probably turn out to be my bitterest flop. I can already hear the rationalist knives being sharpened from me from Perth to Brisbane.
But you see, even that statement, sometimes I do think that Patrick deliberately drove things to extremes in order to drive people mad, wild. Really, you do actually wonder. It is quite interesting, the mystical tradition, because he calls Himmelfarb an Orthodox Jew, but in fact he was a secular Jew who then discovers the Kabbalah, which is books out of the Jewish mystical tradition. So it's and a lot of Orthodox Jews would not really like that. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I get the sense with White's mysticism that it's all bound up with this metaphor of seeing, which recurs over and again. I mean, there's seeing. There are people who see literally in White, and then there are people who see in a larger sort of metaphorical sense. I mean, there's a line that recurs in some of his work. I think in the art story, there's a character who's about whom he says, "She saw clearly, but not far." Yeah. And I think there's a similar formula used with Mrs. Jolly, perhaps at one point in here, and the vision itself is seen in terms of light and illumination.
Well, he actually calls his riders, at one stage he calls them illuminous. And what is so interesting to me is that these characters that are seen as bizarre, as weird, as deficient by everybody else, they each of them know that they have something different, but something special, and they recognise it in the other. And, it may be, I don't know, I was going to say the romantic in me. I mean the romantic in terms of the romantic tradition, not in terms of romance.
Well, there's certainly an element of romanticism in White's vision, I think, quite a strong one.
Well, it appeals to me. I mean, at the points in the novel when two of the riders will meet together, I'm quite enraptured by it. The fact that they recognise each other, they speak in a shorthand. Even in White's language, it's a shorthand. There's something, and maybe, and I hadn't thought about this before. I believe very strongly in the power of fiction to take you to places that you would never normally go. And, sometimes I sort of wish that there were more novels like the 19th century novels that, I could fall into their embrace and rise again a week later. The thing is, I can do that with this particular book. There's
I think
wonderful
with
fiction
White,
to it.
that mystical religious vision is bound up with his view of art. And the fact that it's up to art to illuminate these visions. There is, at several points in the novel, there are characters who point out who suggest that kind of words are inadequate. There's a scene where early on where Miss Hare and Himmelfarb first meet, and he says of his wartime experiences, there are things that have happened to me that you cannot understand. And she says, well, okay, maybe. But then she says, but there's always something that you can always, get a glimpse, And so that's a profession of faith in imagination, I think.
And I think that this is a book about the imagination, and yes, the human spirit, but it's more about the imagination rather than, great religious themes. I mean, in terms of, I always smile in this book, it actually happens a few times when words are found to be inadequate. Himmelfarb and Dubbo, they actually work at the same place, but they never speak except that once in the bathroom. In fact, Dubbo hardly speaks at all, but he knows.
I'll just say at this point, we have some ushers at the side with microphones, and do feel free to stick your hand up and ask questions and kind of join in the discussion if you are so inclined. So just throw your hand up and someone will come and hand the microphone over. I think it ties in with what you were saying. You were reading out some examples of his sentences which don't actually quite make sense on a grammatical level, but actually kind of work, that add to the tension or the atmosphere and so on. And we have a question just down the back here.
Oh, it's more of an observation, I guess. I think, I'm not going to swear to it, but I'm pretty sure that there's a reference to Doug being used in referring to a breast in Romeo and Juliet. And it wouldn't surprise me if Patrick White was that obscure in making that reference. So if you dig back and read the text of Romeo and Juliet, I think it's in a speech that Nurse gives to Juliet. She uses the term Doug to describe her breasts.
Oh, so there you go.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm probably not going to shift, but I will check out Romeo and Juliet. The earliest reference, I looked it up in the OED, was in the 1500, 1540 or so. So it is. Thank you. I will check it out.
Now, I should wanted to ask you something a little bit off the track, but in your email, you mentioned in your speech that your agent was also White's agent, and that she has regaled you with some stories about Patrick over the years. Do you have any you might want to share with us?
Well, she has. Barbara Mobbs was working for Curtis Brown, who Curtis Brown was a group, was Patrick's agent. And anyway, there was a falling out between Barbara Mobbs, and anybody who knows Mobbs would believe that, maybe. She does not suffer fools at all. Anyway, she would have been in her late 20s. She was young at the time. And there she was without a job, out on a limb, and Patrick contacted her. Patrick, who was Curtis Brown's probably most important client, and he not only offered her financial assistance, he said that he would be her first client. And she looked after him, and she has looked after the estate in a way that, it's been wonderful. I mean, all of Patrick White's work, pretty much all, is back in print now. We're seeing new stage productions of his plays. There have been operas and so on. And also, after Patrick died, Mopsy looked after Manoli too. She also was the one that bought a new television for Manoli after Patrick died, the mean old fellow he was. But yeah, look, the best way actually of learning about Patrick's stories that are for public consumption are through the letters, through his own words. The letters have been collected by David Marr, and the wonderful biography. I mean, the thing was, and David Marr always said this, that Patrick was very open with David Marr, and he did not ask for the right of refusal, to put black marks through the biography.
Well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about him is the things that made him monstrous are also the things that made him interesting and great. And I think a lot of the falling out with people was that he had certain ideals and they didn't quite, live up to them.
The thing with Patrick, he said himself that he found forgiveness very hard. What I think is extraordinary is that he took the actions of other people, actions that mightn't have had anything to do with him, very personally. So, for example, when Sidney Nolan's wife committed suicide, that was the end of that relationship with Sidney, because Patrick blamed Sidney for his wife's suicide. Jeff Dutton was shoved to the outer because in the late 70s he sold out to Mobil Oil. He accepted an AO from Malcolm Fraser, the enemy. And by 1980 this extraordinary friendship was finished. And when Nanette, who was Jeff Dutton's first wife, approached Patrick, not having realised that they were off his invitation list, approached Patrick, and she was about a housekeeper, and she asked him, you know, why won't you let me help? And he said, because you're vile, vile, vile. He had a tongue on him that could slice you off at the knees, I tell you.
Well, I mean, you see a bit of that in some of the satirical venom that he brings to some of his portraits. I mean, Mrs. Flack and Mrs. Jolly, who I think at one point, you know, that they're a kind of double act, but at one point they're described as almost having the same kind of consciousness where they just kind of sit there and fester about.
I think Julian Flack. I didn't see this on the first reading, and perhaps not even the second reading, but this reading, the two evil widows, I think they are absolutely superb. I could see them in that living room being pompous and self-righteous and evil. I
yes.
really
well, there's a bit of the David Malouf quote which I omitted, but I'll just give you now. Mrs. Jolly, Mrs. Flack, vaudeville figures whose gentility would do credit to Edna Everage, sarsaparillas, defenders of home and Hoover, for whom all is sanctified by cake, surely two of the great comic monsters of modern fiction, provide a chorus for the progress of the Jew Himmelfarb toward a mock crucifixion. Yeah, they're he was very good at those kind of grotesques, wasn't he? I mean,
they are grotesque. I mean, there is great humour in this very serious novel. But there is.
Yeah, oh yes, yeah, I think so. In those portraits. Actually, we are nearly out of time. So if you do have any more questions, if anyone would like to throw up their hand, we can probably take one or two more questions. But we're just about out of time. Anyone? No. No? Well, I think we are just about done in that case. I would like to thank... this is actually the last one for the year, the last of these for the year. So I want to thank everybody who has come along throughout the year, particularly those people who have come along regularly. I know there's some familiar faces in the audience who have come along each month. So thank you to you all. And thank you, of course, to this evening's guest, Andrea Goldsmith. Thank you.